She stood alone in the glittering ballroom, surrounded by warmth that never reached her skin. The chandeliers blazed overhead, the music swirled in elegant waves, and all around her silk gowns rustled as couples moved toward the dance floor. But Alara, Duchess of Winthorne, remained perfectly still. Her gloved hands were clasped before her, her smile fixed and fragile as porcelain. No one approached her. No one asked her to dance, not even her husband. Alexander Ashbourne, the Duke of Winthorne, stood across the room with his back half turned to her, deep in conversation with Lord Pemberton and a cluster of politicians. He had not looked at her once in the 2 hours they had been here. He had not offered his arm when they entered. He had not introduced her to anyone. She might as well have been a shadow on the wall. A whisper slid through the air behind her, soft but sharp as a blade. "Poor thing, a duke's wife, and he hasn't danced with her since the wedding. You know, he only married her for her family's connections. She was a last resort. They say he still visits his first wife's grave every week. How could a living woman ever compete with a ghost?" Alara's fingers tightened around her champagne glass until the stem threatened to snap. She set it down carefully on a passing tray and let her smile widen, pretending she had heard nothing at all. But inside, something small and hopeful was withering. Something that had believed once that this marriage might become more than a transaction. She had been so naive. The ride back to Winthorne Hall was silent. The carriage swayed gently over cobblestone streets, and Alexander sat across from her, his profile illuminated by the passing lamps. He was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and dark, unsmiling eyes. The kind of handsome that made a woman's heart ache for a single soft glance, but he never gave her one. "You should have danced," he said at last, his voice low and even. Alara looked at him. "With whom, you did not ask me." His jaw tightened. "You could have danced with anyone. You are the Duchess of Winthorne. It is expected. I am your wife. It is also expected that you would acknowledge me." The words came out quieter than she intended, but they landed. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. Then it was gone, shuttered behind that cold, impenetrable mask he wore like armor. "I had matters to discuss," he said. Alara turned her face toward the window and watched the city dissolve into countryside. She did not speak again that night. The marriage had been arranged 6 months earlier, a swift and businesslike affair. Her father's estate had been drowning in debt, and the Duke of Winthorne had appeared with an offer no one could refuse. He would settle every outstanding obligation, restore the Vancroft name, and in return, Alara would become his duchess. She had been 22, romantic enough to hope that perhaps there was some hidden tenderness behind the arrangement. He had chosen her after all. Out of all the eligible young ladies, he had asked for her hand. But the wedding night had been a study in polite distance. He had kissed her forehead, told her she would want for nothing, and then retreated to his own chambers. In the months that followed, he treated her with impeccable courtesy and absolute detachment. He provided for her, he escorted her to functions, he saw to her comfort with meticulous care. But he never smiled at her. He never sought her company. He never once looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he loves. At first she tried. She arranged his favorite meals, she lingered in the library hoping he would sit with her, she wore the colors he once mentioned he liked. She asked gentle questions about his day, his interests, his memories of the estate. His answers were always brief, polite, and final, a door closing softly but firmly in her face. The only time she saw a glimmer of real emotion in him was when she mentioned his first wife, Celeste. It had been an innocent question, asked early in their marriage. What was she like? Alexander's expression had frozen, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Then very quietly he had replied, "She was everything." And he had walked out of the room, leaving Alara with a cold, hollow ache that never quite went away. So she stopped asking. She stopped hopping. She learned to move through the vast, elegant halls of Winthorne Hall like a ghost herself, smiling when expected, speaking when spoken to, and slowly, quietly dying inside. The change began on an ordinary Tuesday in late autumn. Alara had been walking through the village, as she often did now, looking for any small distraction from the oppressive silence of the house. She passed the baker, the blacksmith, the little stone church with its crooked spire, and eventually found herself near the edge of the village green, where a group of children were huddled together in the cold. They were thin, poorly dressed, and their teacher, a weary-looking young woman, was trying to conduct a lesson with a single worn slate and a piece of chalk that was mostly dust. Alara stopped. Something stirred in her chest, something besides sorrow. "Why are you teaching them out here?" she asked. The teacher looked up, startled. "Your Grace, there is no schoolroom, ma'am. The old building collapsed last winter and the parish cannot afford to rebuild." Alara looked at the children, their bright eyes and chapped cheeks, and she felt a sudden, fierce need to do something useful, something that was hers alone. That afternoon she went to see the steward. She asked about the estate's unused properties, the empty cottages, the neglected dowager house on the eastern edge of the grounds. She requested funds for repairs, supplies, books. The steward hesitated, glancing toward the main house as if expecting the Duke to intervene. But Alexander was away in London for the week, and Alara was, on paper at least, the mistress of Winthorne. "Do it," she said, and her voice was firmer than it had been in months. "I will take responsibility." When Alexander returned, he found a schoolhouse taking shape. Children's laughter echoed across the grounds. His wife was no longer waiting for him in the drawing room with a hopeful expression. She was busy, she was distracted, she was happy, and he did not know what to make of it. At first, he said nothing. He watched from the window of his study as she walked through the gardens with plans in her hands, her hair escaping its pins in the breeze. She looked younger, lighter. She did not glance up at his window the way she used to. She did not pause as if hoping he might join her. It should have been a relief. He had never wanted her attention, had he? He had married her out of obligation, a practical arrangement to secure her family's future and provide the Winthorne estate with a respectable duchess. He had told himself repeatedly that affection was not necessary, that distance was safer, that he had no right to happiness after what happened to Celeste. But watching Alara laugh with the village children, watching her kneel in the dirt to plant flowers she had chosen herself, watching her slip out of his orbit with quiet, steady grace, something inside him began to ache in a way he did not understand. He told himself it was irritation. It was not. The first real crack in his composure came one evening a month later. The schoolhouse was finished, and Alara had organized a small celebration for the villagers. Candles glowed in the newly repaired windows, and the sound of a fiddle drifted through the twilight. Alexander had not planned to attend. He had work to do, correspondence to review, a brandy to drink in solitude. But his feet carried him down the path anyway, drawn by a curiosity he refused to name. He stood in the shadow of an old oak and watched. Alara was in the center of the room, a child on each hand, spinning in a clumsy, joyful dance. Her gown was simple and a little dusty. Her cheeks were flushed. She was laughing, really laughing, for the first time since he had married her. And then a man stepped forward and took her hand to lead her into the next dance. Alexander straightened. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile and sandy hair. Sir Julian Cross, the young baronet from the neighboring estate. He had been visiting the village more frequently of late. Alexander had noticed. He had dismissed it. Now, watching Julian's hand settle at Alara's waist with perfect, casual familiarity, he felt something hot and sharp twist in his chest. Jealousy. He recognized it with a shock that left him breathless. He had no right to feel it. He had given her nothing but distance and silence. He had let her wither in his house for half a year, and yet the sight of another man making her smile felt like a wound. He turned and walked back to the hall without a word. Alara did not notice him leave. She was too busy feeling alive for the first time in what felt like forever. The weeks that followed brought a strange, uneasy tension between them. Alexander began appearing in rooms he had never frequented before. He lingered at the breakfast table long after the meal was finished, watching Alara over the edge of his newspaper. He found reasons to walk through the East Wing where she now spent most of her days. He asked her stilted questions about the school, the children, her plans for the Dowager House, which she had decided to turn into a residence for widows and orphans. Alara answered politely, but she did not invite him to visit. She did not ask for his opinion. She had stopped seeking his approval, and it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. One afternoon, she returned from the village to find him waiting in the entrance hall. His expression was unreadable, but his posture was tense. "You were with Sir Julian again," he said. "It was not a question." Alara paused, pulling off her gloves. "He has been helping with the school. The children adore him." "The children?" "Yes," she met his gaze calmly. "He offered to repair the old piano. He plays beautifully." Alexander's jaw tightened. How generous of him! There was an edge in his voice she had never heard before. It might have wounded her once. Now it only made her tired. "Is there something you wish to say, Your Grace?" she asked, using his title with deliberate formality. He flinched so slightly she almost missed it. "No," he said, "nothing at all." He turned and walked away, and Alara watched him go with a heart that felt strangely, distantly sad. Not broken, not anymore, just bruised the way an old injury ached before a storm. The following week brought the Winthorne annual charity dinner, a grand event Alexander hosted every autumn. It was the first time Alara would preside as Duchess, and she had prepared meticulously. The great hall gleamed with candlelight and silver. Guests arrived in carriages that stretched down the drive. Everything was perfect, and she moved through the evening with graceful composure, greeting lords and ladies, directing servants, ensuring every detail was flawless. Alexander watched her from across the room, and for the first time he did not look away. He saw the way other men's eyes followed her. He saw the quiet confidence in her posture, the gentle authority in her voice. She was no longer the uncertain bride who had flinched at whispers. She was a woman who had built something beautiful with her own two hands, and she did not need him anymore. The realization struck him like a blow. Sir Julian approached her during the dancing, bowing with that easy smile. "A dance, Your Grace. You promised me one at the school opening, and I have not forgotten." Alara hesitated, glancing instinctively toward Alexander. He was watching them. His expression was unreadable, but his hand had tightened around his glass. Something in her chest twisted, old habit, old hope, but she pushed it aside. She had spent too many nights waiting for a husband who never came. She would not let him cast a shadow over this moment too. "I would be delighted," she said, and let Julian lead her onto the floor. The music swelled, and they moved together with natural ease. Julian's conversation was light and warm, and for a few minutes Alara allowed herself to simply enjoy the feeling of being seen, being valued. It was not love, she knew that, but it was friendship, and it was more than she had ever received from her own husband. When the dance ended, she looked up to find Alexander standing at the edge of the floor. His face was pale, his eyes dark with an emotion she could not name. He did not approach. He simply turned and left the ballroom. She did not follow him. Later that night, Alara returned to her chambers to find a letter on her pillow. Her heart lurched. She had not received a personal note from Alexander since the day before their wedding, a brief, formal message welcoming her to Winthorne. She unfolded it with unsteady hands. The handwriting was his, but the words were not what she expected. "I have arranged for the Dowager House to receive additional funds from my personal accounts. The work you are doing is worthy. I should have told you sooner." No signature, no endearment, just a statement of fact. And yet the paper trembled in her hand. He had noticed. He had acted. She pressed the letter to her chest, and for one treacherous moment hope flickered inside her again. But she did not go to him. She did not thank him. She placed the letter in her drawer and climbed into bed, and she told herself that money was not the same as love, and she would not mistake one for the other. The following week, Alara made a decision that changed everything. She stood in the doorway of Alexander's study, her hands folded before her, her expression calm. He looked up from his desk with something like surprise. She rarely sought him out anymore. "I would like to move into the Dowager house," she said. The pen in his hand went still. "I beg your pardon. The renovations are nearly complete. There is more than enough space for me to live there and oversee the work directly. I would be closer to the children and the widows. It would be more practical." Alexander rose slowly to his feet. His face was ashen. "You wish to leave Winthorne Hall?" "I wish to have a purpose," she said quietly, "and I have found one, that is all." He stared at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. "You are my wife. Your place is here." "My place," she repeated, and for the first time a flicker of old pain crept into her voice. "I have spent months trying to find my place in this house. I have been a ghost in these halls, Alexander, a decoration, a duty. I cannot live like that anymore. I will not." He flinched at the sound of his name. She had not called him that since the early days, when she still believed they might become something more. "Alara," he took a step toward her, "I never meant—" "I know," she interrupted gently. "You never meant to hurt me, but you did, and I have healed myself. Please do not ask me to stay in a place where I am invisible." The silence stretched between them, heavy and aching. Then Alexander did something she had never seen him do. His shoulders slumped, his mask cracked, and for just a moment he looked utterly lost. "If that is what you truly want," he said, his voice rough, "I will not stop you." Alara nodded once and left the room. She did not let herself cry until she was alone. She moved into the Dowager house on a cool, clear morning in November. The building was modest but warm, filled with light and the scent of fresh paint. The children greeted her with cheers, and the widows had tea waiting in the little parlor. It felt more like home than Winthorne Hall ever had. But Alexander did not visit. He sent no messages. She told herself it was for the best. 2 weeks passed. The autumn leaves fell in golden drifts across the grounds. The school flourished. The widows began to smile again. Alara kept herself busy from dawn until dusk, and when she lay down at night exhausted, she almost managed to forget the hollow ache in her chest. Almost. Then on a stormy evening, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Alexander standing in the rain, his greatcoat soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked wild and undone, nothing like the cold, controlled duke she had married. "May I come in?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the last word. She stepped aside without a word, and he strode into the small sitting room, dripping onto the worn rug. The firelight cast dancing shadows across his face, and she saw, for the first time, the dark circles under his eyes, the weight of sleepless nights. "I cannot do this anymore," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Watching you from a distance, pretending I do not care. I lied to you, Alara. I have been lying since the day we met." She stood very still. "What do you mean?" He dragged a hand through his wet hair, his expression tormented. "Celeste, my first wife. Everyone believes she died in a riding accident. That is what I told the world. That is what I told myself for years." He closed his eyes. "But it was not an accident, not truly." Alara's breath caught. "She was leaving me." His voice dropped to a raw whisper. "She had been unfaithful for months. The day she died, she was running away with another man. Their carriage lost a wheel on the coast road and went over a cliff. I found out the truth from her maid afterward. I destroyed the evidence. I told everyone it was a tragic mishap. I could not bear the shame. I could not bear the truth." His voice broke. "I have carried that secret for 7 years, and I buried my heart with it." Alara pressed a hand to her mouth. She had imagined 1,000 reasons for his coldness, but never this. He had built a fortress of ice around himself, not because he was still in love with Celeste, but because he had been shattered by her betrayal, and he had been too proud and too wounded to let anyone else in. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked, her voice trembling. He lifted his gaze to hers and his dark eyes were wet with unshed tears. "Because I am losing you, and I cannot bear it. I have lost so much already, Alara. I cannot lose you too. Not when he stopped, struggling. Not when I love you." The words fell between them like stones into still water. Alara stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "You love me. You have never once shown me anything but distance and duty. You left me alone in a house full of whispers. You let me believe I was nothing to you." "I know," he said, his voice cracking with anguish. "I was a coward. I was so afraid of being hurt again, so afraid of failing someone else I cared for that I pushed you away before you could get close. I told myself it was safer that way. I told myself I did not deserve happiness after what happened. But every time you smiled at me, every time you tried to reach me, I felt it, and I ran from it." He took a shaking step toward her. "Then I saw you with Cross, and I thought I would go mad. Not because I was angry at you, because I realized what I had thrown away." She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "That is not fair, Alexander. You cannot ignore me for months and then declare your love because another man offered me a dance." "I know it is not fair." He dropped to his knees on the threadbare rug, heedless of his pride, of his title, of everything but the desperate hope in his eyes. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I am asking anyway. I am begging you, please. Give me a chance to prove that I am not the cold, heartless man you married. Let me try to be worthy of you, even if it takes the rest of my life." She looked down at him, this proud, broken duke kneeling at her feet, and she felt the walls around her own heart begin to crumble. "Why did you choose me?" she whispered. "Out of all the women in England, why did you arrange to marry me?" He looked up at her and a new, softer grief crossed his face. "I saw you once," he said. "2 years ago, you were at a country fair in Surrey. You were laughing with a group of children, helping them win a ribbon at a game. Your hair had come undone and there was a smudge of dirt on your cheek, and you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." His voice dropped to a murmur. "I asked about you afterward. I learned your name, your family. And when I heard your father was in difficulty, I thought, perhaps this was my chance to have something good in my life. Something I did not deserve, but wanted more than anything." Alara's knees gave way, and she sank down onto the rug in front of him. "All this time," she breathed, "all this time I thought you married me out of pity, or duty, or convenience." "I married you because I was already half in love with you," he said, his voice thick. "And I spent every day after the wedding trying not to fall the rest of the way, because I was terrified of losing you the way I lost everything else." A sob escaped her, raw and aching. She reached out and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the chill of rain on his skin, the roughness of stubble, the tremble of a man who had held himself together for so long he had forgotten how to fall apart. "You fool," she whispered, "you absolute fool." And then she kissed him, softly, gently, a kiss full of forgiveness and heartbreak and new beginnings. He made a broken sound against her lips and wrapped his arms around her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had been crumbling for years. They stayed there on the floor for a long time, tangled together in the firelight, not speaking, just holding on. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, something quiet and fragile began to heal. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Healing was slow and uneven. Some mornings Alexander still retreated into silence, and Alara still flinched at the memory of cold ballrooms. But he came to the Dowager house every day. He read to the children. He walked with her through the village. He learned to say her name like a prayer instead of a duty. He told her the rest of the truth, piece by painful piece. The guilt he carried for Celeste's death, even knowing she had betrayed him. The way he had locked his heart in an iron cage and thrown away the key. The way he had watched her from his study window during those early months, longing to cross the distance but paralyzed by fear. And she told him her own truths. The nights she had cried herself to sleep. The morning she had decided to stop waiting. The moment she had looked at Sir Julian's kind smile and realized she felt nothing more than friendship, because her heart was still tangled up in a man who had never once looked at her the way Julian did. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Alexander took her back to Winthorne Hall. But this time, he did not leave her side. He introduced her to every guest at the small gathering as my wife, Alara, who has done more for this estate than I have in a decade. He danced with her 3 times, and when the music ended, he kissed her hand in front of everyone, not caring who saw. That night, they walked through the gardens together, and he stopped beneath the old oak tree where he had once watched her from the shadows. "I have something for you," he said, and pressed a small velvet box into her palm. She opened it to find a locket. Inside was a miniature painting of the two of them, side by side, and a tiny pressed flower from the schoolhouse garden. "It is not enough," he said, his voice unsteady. "Nothing could ever be enough, but I wanted you to have something that says I see you. I have always seen you, and I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you know it." Alara closed the locket and held it against her heart. The night air was cool and soft, and the stars were beginning to appear above them, faint and silver. "You once told me I was a duty," she said quietly. "Do you remember?" He winced. "I remember. I do not want to be a duty anymore." "You are not." He cupped her chin and tilted her face toward his. "You are my choice, my only choice. From the very beginning, Alara, it was always you." She smiled then, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and made them shine. "Then I choose you too, Alexander. Not because I have to, because I want to." He pulled her into his arms, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was not a perfect love story. It was messy and painful and full of lost time. But it was theirs. And as they stood together beneath the wide, star-strewn sky, both of them understood that some things, once broken, could be rebuilt into something even stronger. The schoolhouse continued to thrive. The widow's residence became a model for the county. Sir Julian Cross remained a dear friend, and when he eventually married a sweet-natured vicar's daughter, Alara danced at his wedding with genuine joy. And every evening, no matter how busy the day had been, Alexander found her in the garden or the library or the nursery. They eventually filled with laughter, and he took her hand and simply held it as if to say, "I am here. I am not leaving. I love you." The whispers faded. The cold ballrooms became distant memories, and the Duchess of Winthorne, who had once been a ghost in her own home, became the heart of a house finally filled with warmth.